We are joined by our regular guest, Professor Salim Mansur of Western University in London, Ontario, to discuss 1 year after the Freedom Convoy, the Trucker Freedom Convoy of Canada, which happened January 28th, 29th of 22, leading into the imposition of the Emergency Act by the unethical Justin Trudeau, to resolve itself after that February 14th, so late February. There was a violent disruption of the convoy by the police, who used weapons, which were not discharged, but were certainly unholstered, smashing trucks' windows, grabbing people out of their trucks, stealing their property, arresting people. It was quite a dramatic affair. And this discussion, I hope, will go into a fundamental nature of our country as a nation state, or a post-national state, if we take the unethical Justin Trudeau's description of our country. How did we get ourselves into a situation where the grassroots of this nation, by about 1 million, by some estimations, across coast to coast, even though it was just in the tens of thousands that finally perched in Ottawa. How did we get all this grassroots movement against our government's lockdowns, our government's imposition, our government's destruction of the rights that are supposedly enumerated and guaranteed in our Charter of Rights and Freedoms? So let's delve a bit into the history of this country, how we got to this point, what our Charter of Rights and Freedoms actually means, if it means anything at all. Who is sovereign in this nation? The people, the parliament, God? You know, these questions are not being debated. But with this great awakening of the Freedom Convoy, I think a lot of people are starting to ask these fundamental questions and examine and re-examine all of our institutions and the raison d'etre of Canada as a nation. So Salim, what are your takeaways from this convoy, given that kind of a context?
Yes, Robert, thanks for doing this conversation or arranging this conversation on the first anniversary of the Trucker Freedom Convoy that began, I believe, on January 28, 29 from the west and came down to Ottawa, and truckers from all across the country joined it. And by the way, you mentioned, but I mean, I re-emphasize, it was also a movement that caught the imagination of the people around the world.
Yes, indeed.
In the United States, in Europe. And so what the truckers set in motion as a peaceful demonstration coming to their nation's capital, Ottawa, was then imitated and emulated in other parts of the world. It was done in the United States and some of the European countries and Australia and so on. So in that sense of the drama, it was dramatic. And the question then is, or talking about it, is then, why did it come about? How did it come about? You know, it was truly a spontaneous, as you say, grassroots movement that was sparked by common people. In our case, in the Canadian case, the Trucker Convoy was sparked by a Métis woman, a grandmother. I'm talking about Tamara Leach, who has now become, in a sense, the iconic face of that movement in Canada because of what she went through. She was arrested, she was abused, she was, bailed out, and then again rearrested, and so on and so forth. And then, as you point out, the government responded, the prime minister responded, and the whole parliament, let's say, responded with heavy-handedness to crush the truckers' movement by invoking the Emergencies Act on Valentine's Day, February 14th. So what a Valentine gift to the Canadian people, who all or a majority of Canadian people who all supported the truckers. So yes, it was a dramatic event, and the result is a mixed bag of the drama, what was demonstrated that the people can come forward and come together in a manner in which I suppose government and the ruling elite, the ruling class, the political elite never imagined. So it was a test between the people and the government, the ruling class, the ruling elite. But it was also a demonstration of the response, which showed that the ruling elite is not going to hesitate to use the full power. And the full power of what? Of the authority of the Parliament, of the Constitution of Canada. So in my view, looking back at it a year later, and this will be part of our country's history now. People will look back upon it, and this is not going away. This model of protest and demonstration is going to be there in bigger ways or smaller ways, but is now going to be part of our political culture. So from my perspective, the great achievement of the truckers movement, though the media won't talk about it, and I don't know to what extent the academia is going to talk about it, the university and so on and so forth. We are a country that has basically no free speech after the passage of C-11 only a couple of days ago. So the monitoring and control of free speech is becoming increasingly restricted. So to what extent people are going to talk about it in the official sense, through the media, through the academic institution and so forth, I don't know. I doubt it very much, because what has happened is the expose of our Constitution, particularly our Charter of Rights and Freedom, that indeed this is all cosmetic, and that there is very little substance behind it, and that leads to a discussion, or should lead to a discussion, and I hope we can have some of it today, which needs to get deeper and wider among the Canadian people, or among the people who care about what the Charter of Rights and Freedom is supposed to stand for. And that has been exposed, because it was a Charter of Rights and Freedom that was trashed by this Prime Minister, in effect. So a mixed bag, but that exposure is terrific. It's terrific because the veil has fallen from the eyes of a substantive number of people. And they will begin talking about it. There is a freedom movement in this country. There is the People's Party of Canada. There is Maxime Bernier, who was there all along. There are some of the only living founding father, so to speak, that gave birth to the Charter of Rights and Freedom and the patriation of the Constitution in 1982. Brian Peckford, the former premier of Newfoundland, is still alive, still among us, 40 plus years later, and his voice is added to the voice of people like Maxime Bernier and the common people who rallied forward, holding the flag and defending the rights on the basis of the Charter of Rights and Freedom. So this conversation will go forward, and to what extent this conversation is going to shape the future direction of our constitutional form of government, the parliamentary form of government, and to what extent the people in power are going to respond accordingly is a matter up for debate.
And it's interesting to note, Salim, some of the ancillary or sideline issues that evolved from this. Besides the weighty questions of the Constitution and the Charter of Rights, we now have at the request of the police, banks freezing people's bank accounts, not with a warrant from a court in case of alleged crimes, but just the cops calling up the banks and they freeze somebody's bank account. egregious. What do you think of that?
Well, I mean, what this has exposed is the immense power in the hand of the government, and that they are not going to hesitate to use it to impose the will of the government over the wishes and desires and rights of the people in this struggle. And so it comes back to the heart of the matter. People and government, people and state. And what this whole thing, I mean, whether it is the seizure of bank accounts, the digitalization of the economy, the taking away of our basic rights by imposing mandates, mask mandate, vaccine mandate, social distancing, closing down the schools and institutions, closing down businesses, locking up the churches, fencing up the churches, arresting some of the pastors. These are things that happened, and then of course, what we saw play out in Ottawa, that is during the period, the 3 weeks or so, or less than 3 weeks, from January 28, 29 to the imposition of the Emergencies Act on February 14 of 2022, and the use of force to arrest and disband the people in Ottawa who had come from all points of the country, has shown that the will of the government and the power of the government is not bound by anything, is not handcuffed by anything. That is what the Constitution is supposed to be. A constitution in a democracy that we believe that we are and were. And that's the curtain that has dropped from the eyes of the people, or at least the people who are alert to this issue, is a constitution in a democracy is a handcuff on the government, not on the people. It lays out what the government, based upon the consent of the people, as representative of the people, as elected by the people, can do and cannot do, And what it can do is enumerated by the people through their consent, that this is what the government can do, this is what the government has the authority to do on these issues. Those are enumerated and listed. And everything other than that, the people are free to do. Free to believe, free to think, free to write, free to gather, free to assemble, and so on and so forth. And what this exposed, once again, this exposed, by the way, after the Charter of Rights and Freedom was added to the BNA Act of 1867. So basically, our Constitution is the BNA Act of 1867, which is now called the Constitution Act of 1867, after the patriation, and to which was added the Charter of Rights and Freedom, at the heart of which is the amending formula. So we need, if you have the time, to go quickly back and look at this history, because what is now in question and should be in question is, what does our Constitution stand for? What does it represent? Does it represent the people, or does it represent the elite?
Well, you and I spoke at length about this recently, and I think that we both came to the conclusion that Canada is not a nation of we the people, regardless of what we may think. It is a nation of we the Parliament, or we the Crown. And while we have a document like our Constitution, the BNA Act of 1867, the Canada Act 1982, which repatriated the BNA Act, and then the subsequent act, which involved the addition of a Charter of Rights and Freedoms, that really doesn't matter, apparently, to our parliamentarians who consider themselves to be above the people and not by and for the people. They can and have demonstrated that the documents upon which this country is founded are not worth the paper they're written on, because they can and have violated our rights for years, during the last 3 years, notably. For example, I had to show my papers to get into this province of New Brunswick, a complete violation of my right to freedom of mobility. There should be no borders to Canadians within this country, and yet we had them. I noticed that when they first set up a patrol on the bridge going from Ottawa to Gatineau, and the Quebec government would only allow Quebecers back and forth and not Ontarians. And right then and there, I said that this is the end of this country, if that is allowed, and it was allowed. And that's the thing, is that justice is so slow. It can take 10 years to get a piece, a protest about a law from the ground to the Supreme Court, so that that law can be demonstrated to be unlawful. And that's what happened. You had Trudeau on the 14th invoke the Emergencies Act, and for a whole week, our rights were trampled on, or they did not exist in law. To be truthful, they did not exist in law, because they had a week for the Senate to say yay or nay, and then the Senate, I watched most of the debate on the Senate, about 15 hours of it, and it was not going good for the unethical Justin Trudeau's government. They were going to overturn it. And so what he did was he pulled the rug out from their debate and says, I'm going to overturn it myself. The time has come, I'm going to no longer use the Emergencies Act. So, I mean, if they can do that, what good is our documents? What good are they? I mean, we're living in, basically it's anarchy, right? It is that we live at the whim of a prime minister, is what we do, and the whim of Parliament. And by the way, Parliament was all in lockstep during this whole thing, more or less. There were some conservatives who voiced dissatisfaction at what was going on, but in general, the convoy participants were vilified by all parliamentarians and all of the press that received funding from the Liberal government. So it's very depressing to see what has happened here, Salim. So is the Constitution worth the paper it's written on?
Well, Robert, you say, I mean, the premise in your observation that you have made is that our rights have been violated. That's the core argument. Our rights have been violated. My question is, do we have rights? If you don't have rights, what has been violated?
Well, of course we have rights. The thing is that they are enumerated in the Charter of Rights and Freedoms. We have rights because they are a logical consequence of us being rational individuals. Of course we have rights. Some may say that they are given by God, and that's fine by me as well. The thing is that even in our Charter of Rights and Freedoms, it says Canada is founded on the notion of the supremacy of God and the rule of law, so not on people.
So yeah, I mean, I have the Canadian Constitution right in my hand, so we can go through if you want, if you have the time on this matter. Yeah, we have the words, we have the document, we have the paper, but at the same time, in your observations, you said that it's not worth the paper on which it is written.
It's apparently not.
Okay, so there are two in a sense, contradictory statement. We have rights. It is not worth the paper on which it is written. Your observation is in sync with the people who came to Ottawa. So let's talk about that. You began, and this is a year later, we're talking about this. The people who came to Ottawa. There were several thousand people who came to Ottawa. Men and women, and some brought their children. And they were of varying ages, and they came, and they had massive amount of support, or especially massive amount of support outside of the urban centers of Canada. And in particular, at the heart of that support was in Alberta, the prairie provinces, and the interior of British Columbia, And then the same thing, in the rural or non-urban centers of Ontario and the Maritimes. So that support was there, and they came and they believed that we have rights. What rights we have? We have the right to express our opinion. We have the right to protest. We have the right to, gather together and to peacefully demonstrate. In other words, the event in Ottawa of the truckers getting together was also, in so many different ways, a classic demonstration in real time of the political culture of Canada, right? So history, that we are Canadians, we are a people who are not only peaceful and law-abiding, we're also deferential. We gathered there with the firm belief that our government, which is our elected government, in our parliament, in our nation's capital, will respond to us, the people who are coming to our capital, to do what? To tell the government that for 2 years, what you have been doing is intolerable and is based on no law. And in the process of doing what you are doing, you have impoverished us. You have, taken away what we understand our personal beliefs and fundamental way of existence. Closing down our churches, closing down our school, forcing our children into wearing masks and so on and so forth. For 2 years, you have done that. And we are telling you, we are asking you to bring an end to this. We want to get back to the way of our life before you started doing this to us without our permission. This was not an issue in the 2021 election, for instance. This was not an issue in the 2019 election. You never talked about this. You unilaterally imposed this upon us, and our elected members, to whom we have invested our trust, simply went along, instead of representing us, doing what you decided to do within your body in the parliament. Okay, so this is the drama. This is the actual fact. So we believe that we have rights, and so on and so forth. What was the response? How do a people engage with the government in a democracy on the fundamental premise that the government is a government based upon the consent of the people, because the government is bound by the Constitution, which both the people and the government has this contract. But what happened? The government slammed down upon the people, didn't engage in a conversation, called them names, a fringe movement and so on, and attacked them. I mean, the pictures of Tamara Lish speaks thousands of words about the reality to which I am coming, that the bubble of this understanding that we are a country of a rule of law, based upon a rule of law in which we, the people, give the consent, and the legitimacy of the people in power is derived from the people. That's the election is all about, and so on and so forth. Well, now a year later, if you reflect upon this, that's the question I pose. Do we have rights? Because the action of the government and all the institutions of the government, the law enforcement agencies, the judiciary, and the parliament has 2 houses, so all of the parliament. It is still a hypothetical that whether the Senate would have voted no, the Emergencies Act, because that vote never took place. So while the Emergency Act was at play, all the institution of the government was behind suppressing the people, and suppressing the people violently. So where were the rights? And this is not the first time. Only, in 1970, when the Emergencies Act was known as the War Measures Act, the father of the current prime minister deployed. And again, the parliament came together and accepted it. And those who asked, how far will you go with this War Measure Act? The then prime minister said, watch me. And then that was not the first time. It happened in the two world wars and so on. So it opens up the Pandora's box about what you are talking about, our rights, in the sense that these rights, though mentioned in the documents that each one of us can hold in our hand, what is the actual meaning and price of that right? And that would need to go back into, again, discussing what sort of democracy is Canada? Are we truly a democracy? In what way are we a democracy? And that, I think, is a healthy sign. It is not a negative sign, because in that process of examining who we are and how did we arrive in this situation, in this condition, we open up a conversation that, if it's going to have an effect, a positive effect, will bring about the change that we need, that to make what is nominal by name rights into substantive, that the rights exist, and really handcuffs the government. And that opens up the history. That's what I would say. I mean, if you're talking about, not if, we are talking about it, about Canada as a democracy, we cannot talk about Canada as a democracy in isolation, because there are other democracies. And the most important and the most serious democratic order, Republican constitutional order, is our neighbor to the south. And we are the same people in the sense the original people of Canada, apart from the First Nation, are immigrants from that part of the world who were cousins, that became the 13 colonies in the United States of America and what became the Dominion of Canada. And now, Canada as a country by itself with a constitution, 1867 and 1982. So if we examine this, we have to examine these two countries and their constitutional order. It is surprisingly, we come to the conclusion, and it's all evident, that the Canadian Constitution, 1867 and 1982, together, has no reference to the people. It has reference to the God, but what does it mean? How do you translate that? Whose God is it? Is it the God of the ancient Greeks and Romans and the pagans? Gaia, which is what basically, this prime minister, the Green Party, the NDP, including the Conservative Party, seem to worship more than the God of Abraham, the God of Jews and Christians and Muslims, because this is the God with their worship, that we're going to have a Green New Deal, Gaia, and so on and so forth. So whose God this is? Is this,
Salim,
in any way enforceable?
I think that when they put in that clause, it's actually in the preamble to the Charter.
Exactly, it is in the preamble.
What they mean by that, if I could put words in their mouths, maybe, or interpret it the way they probably thought, is that when that phrase is used, and it's used in other countries as well, it means that this country is founded on the supremacy of God, means that it's not founded on the whim of a king or a potentate, if you will, a czar or a president. It is founded on not a person, but an idea.
It is a preamble. So let's scratch away the preamble if it means nothing. By scratching away the preamble, by, erasing it, does it in any way affect positively or negatively the Charter of Rights? So this is simply a cosmetic. And from the perspective of those who understand God in terms of the God of Abraham, this is a mockery. The American Constitution has no reference to the will of God. You open the American Constitution
We the
and you
people.
go through it. There is no reference to the will of God. And yet the founding fathers clearly understood, as John Adams said, the second president of the United States said, that this Constitution that we have ratified and put together is a Constitution that can only be lived by a Christian people. So the Constitution to have a value has to have a value that transcends in time and space the writers of the Constitution, the authors of the Constitution. That's why we call them founding fathers, right? So 250 years later, the American Constitution, the debate is going on in America. It's a constitutional debate is going on in America, you know, and it goes back to those who want to hold to the original principle of the Constitution and those who want to argue that the Constitution is a living document and it can be changed, it can, you know, be read in a different way, and so on and so forth. So there is a debate, and in a technical sense, this is hermeneutics. That means how do you read the text, you know, and the people who are reading the text now in the 21st century are not the same people who wrote the Constitution and for whom the Constitution was written. Because when Benjamin Franklin came out in 1787, after the Constitution had been written and was going to be presented to the 13 colonies for ratification, according to the story, he was stopped on the street in Philadelphia and asked what you have done. And he said, "Madam," it was a woman, I believe, who stopped him, said, "Madam, we have created a republic. Now it is up to you to keep it." Right? So the Constitution has, like any other, like a sacred sacred book, a scripture, whether it is the Old Testament, the New Testament, the Gita, the Quran, etc., are debated over what the words mean, you know. So we have to take the words seriously, and we have to examine it, and so on and so forth. So we are talking about, you know, here it is, two constitutions as a comparison. And the American Constitution, again, the same people, because we're talking about going back to the 18th century, more or less the same people. America, the 13 colonies were part of British North America, run by, you know, the same parliament in England, with the representatives as governors and lieutenant governors in the colonies in what became United States of America, and in the colonies which became the Dominion of Canada. You know, so same people, same foundation, coming out of which we have two different constitutions, you know, and therefore two different types of democracy. And all I'm pointing out in the substantive discussion of what the events a year ago brought forward is that our Constitution is one in which there's no reference to the people. Reference to God is simply a preamble. There's no reference to the people. You open up the 1867 Act, there's no reference to the people. And in 1982, there's no reference to the people. So people is the ghost of Hamlet's father. You know, he's there, but he's not referred to. His physical presence is not there. His bodily presence is not there. In the case of the American Constitution, everything derives from we the people. It is, you know, it is a document that rests upon the consent of and the legitimacy drawn from we the people. That makes a huge difference, you know. So we are a country, and this is what the point that I was making, Robert. We are a country, if you go back to its roots and its foundation, not a revolutionary country. We are a country built by empire loyalists. We are a country that have been loyal to the mother country, that is England. And America was born out of a revolution against the mother country to whom we are loyal, right? So then we go back to that principle. And in that context, you know, we have always looked to the mother parliament as a child looks to a father or a mother for the basis of how we should behave and how should we manage our affairs. Again, this is a historical fact, and in the American cases, they cut root and branch their connection with their mother country and establish a whole new system, whose basic foundation is a document that rests upon the people, the consent
Well,
of the people.
we're a nation in its infancy then, I guess. And what we witnessed a year ago with the Freedom Convoy was probably a growing pain, I would suggest. That yes, we have a lot of baggage. Canada was knit together over a long period of time up until 1949, when Newfoundland finally joined, from 1867 to 1949. So that's a long history of knitting together various patchwork quilt of a country with competing provinces, competing rights, group rights. Nothing, by the way, that the Americans have. There's no group rights in the American Constitution or their Bill of Rights, but we've got it. We've got language right. We have Aboriginal rights. And so it becomes almost, it's almost an admission that this country cannot stand the test of time. I would suggest that we cannot stand the test of time. This is going to be tearing us apart, especially when we see the population shift from the Laurentians, Ottawa, Montreal, Quebec City, Toronto, over to Vancouver, Calgary, Edmonton, Winnipeg, right? And when we have this tearing apart, it's not going to survive. And maybe the Freedom Convoy was just basically an admission that something's wrong in the state of Denmark, to use your Shakespearean analogy again.
Well, that's exactly where I was driving at, that the unintentional effect. I mean, the Freedom Convoy came, that is all of us who supported the Canadian Convoy, by physically going to Ottawa or by, supporting it in various ways, cheering them, sending money to them and so on and so forth. All of us, that is all Canadians, behind the Freedom Convoy and the Freedom Convoy came believing that their rights had been violated. I think you and I are on agreement on that. We came believing that we have rights and our rights have been violated. The unintentional effect a year later, at least in my view, and maybe I may be alone, or maybe there are many more people now coming to the similar conclusion or are in that direction moving, that the unintentional effect was that we discover that our rights, in your words, are not worth the paper it is written on. So we have a struggle ahead to make the rights, substantive. That is not simply written on paper. It has meaning and it is enforceable. And that will, I think, where we agree, is the direction in which Canada might possibly move or is moving. And that will reveal the tensions as a consequence of that, is going to reveal the cleavages, the divisions, and therefore the fragility of a federation, in a manner that people have to become serious and wake up to that reality, or, again, to use your term, we'll be drifting apart till possibly portions of it break away. So how did this come about? I mean, that is the germane question. And one thing that is missing from my perspective, maybe because of my academic background, maybe because this is my 50th year in Canada as a Canadian. I'm a new Canadian, but I have dug deep into the country that took me in and the country that I came to love, and is my country. My children were born here, and so on and so forth, And so I have taken the trouble, both as in a professional sense of what I ended up being an academic over the last 40 years, but again, that driving passion for history and understanding things in historical context is something that is not readily done in our country. The media is totally silent about it. Media that should be the institution or the medium through which people get educated, they're not engaged about it. Our politicians don't talk about it, and so on. Our academia doesn't engage in it, except for that little body of people who really go deep and become whatever Canadian experts in Canadian politics and culture and sociology and so on and so forth. But it is a germane question. The Americans are far more open to challenging things by going back to the historical roots, the whole America First movement, the Make America Great Again, which is within our living memory of the last few years, is at the heart of it a constitutional debate to restore the American Constitution from the hands of those who have made America in so many ways a post-constitutional republic, the deep state, and so on and so forth. But in Canada, we don't have that debate. We are not having it, but it is absolutely necessary. So I would point out few, again, it's a matter of time, but I just want to quickly point out a few things. We were a country built by the Empire Loyalists. We refused to join the 13 colonies south of the Laurentian Valley that rose up in arms against the tyrant George III, or against the government that George III was the embodiment of, that is, England as the colonial imperial power, and they rose up against it. They put their lives on the line. If they had been defeated, each of the founding fathers, whether they were Christian or deist, doesn't matter. They would have been hanged. Say they took the matter very seriously. They put their skin in the game, and they fought to build a different country. What did we do? Unlike the American colonies, the 13 colonies, we hugged and remained under the umbrella of the British, and we carried on from then till the 1850s, being ruled by the British Parliament and by its representatives in Canada. We were a country where the people in power were compact family, the family compact, the elites in the urban centers that evolved. And then there were the trappers, the loggers, the people who went down, the pioneers, the settlers, the fishermen, and so on and so forth. We were a small population. So it was the elite, the Empire Loyalists, tied in so many different ways to their mother country. Johnny MacDonald, after all, came from Scotland as a child, of the British, crown. So we were tied to them. And by the time 1850s comes along, these ruling elite are very worried. They're very worried that the Americans might come north and take power, take land, take control. They'd already fought wars with Canada. Immediately after 1776, they became independent. And then under Jefferson, there was a war, the 1812 war. And then from the American point of view, it was not a serious war. They did not pursue that war. And the British came down all the way to Washington and defeated the Americans and burned the capital and so on and so forth. But they fought war with the British. By 1850s, they were very worried that this fight might take place. That is, the ruling elite in Canada were very worried about it, But the Americans got involved in their own problems that led to the Civil War and so on and so forth. But for the elite in Canada, which had already had problems, and that history is well known, the uprising of 1838 with William Lyon Mackenzie in Upper Canada, and the uprising in Lower Canada with Papineau had taken place, and the British had sent their governor, Lord Durham, who had identified the problem, two warring nations in the bosom of one state, at the beginning of trying to create, what became the province of Canada, and so on and so forth. But they really wanted the British to invest in Canada for the defense of Canada, that is along the 49th parallel and in the maritime, from any further encroachment by the Americans from the south coming up north. But the British didn't want to invest money in Canada. They wanted the Canadians to find the means through taxation and other purposes. Britain would help to create some sort of a united provinces along the 49 parallel. And that was the effort in the 1850s, which eventually became translated in 1867 by the making of the Dominion of Canada. But in this process, this was a long process, and the danger from the South was always the fear that they would move north, led to eventually the 1867 Act. But the process had begun in the 1850s. And I just want to draw your attention to that process by quoting to you from a letter written by Sir Alexander Galt. And in 1858, he was in London. He was, in fact, the man who was, in a sense, responsible for the building of the railways in Canada, which would later, once Canada became a dominion, would be taken up by Johnny MacDonald in building the railways all the way into British Columbia. So here in 1858, Sir Alexander Galt, on the basis of the consultation that had taken place in Quebec City and in Kingston, and with the permission of the leadership there, had gone to London to discuss a whole number of issues. But in that discussion, this letter was written and signed by Sir Alexander Galt, George Etienne Cartier, and John Ross, who were accompanying him. And I just wonder, it's a long letter. It's dated 25th October, 1858. And it is written to Sir Edward, who was the colonial secretary in London. And I just want to read a passage from this letter. That is the concluding passage from this long letter in which Sir Alexander Galt lays down the distribution of power and so on and so forth in a future dominion between the provinces and the central government, and that they were discussing. But this is the most revealing passage that I want to read. It will be observed that the basis of confederation now proposed differs from that of the United States in several important particulars. It does not profess to be derived from the people. It does not profess to be derived from the people, but would be the constitution provided by the imperial parliament, thus affording the means of remedying any defect which is now practically impossible under the American Constitution. In other words, and he goes on, in other words, the founding fathers of Canada, unlike the founding fathers of America, were going to London with their platter, asking the mother parliament to give them the permission and to write for them the Constitution and make them a dominion. So it was a gift. So now, that is the context, and everything after that we can run through from 1858 to all the way to 1982. With all the landmark events in the constitutional development of Canada we can run through, is one in which it is Ottawa, first as direct colonies of Britain, BNA, and then as a dominion, makes pleas to London, and then London then provides to Ottawa, that is to the Dominion, what it believes through negotiation is fit for Ottawa, you see. So this is an elite construction. That's the exposure that comes around, which I think the people have to grab hold of. In my argument, there is an absence of people. This is a document, this is an agreement, this is a contract that is written by the elite, for the elite, by the elite, in which the people are totally silent or missing. And in effect, the people are the serfs to the elite, the master. Now, the words are there, and so on and so forth are there. But in effect, those words doesn't matter. That is the word now I'm talking about, the Charter of Rights and Freedom, You see, and when you read the words of Charter of Rights and Freedom, leaving aside the preamble, it begins with Section 1, which is a limitation clause. It ends with Section 33, which is a notwithstanding clause, and everything in between, therefore, is within the control of the Parliament. Because the British system of government, unlike the American system of government, which was entirely new, created by the Founding Fathers, is one in which the history of Britain is very germane, and the Canadian has taken that history and swallowed it, because we are, in that sense, empire loyalists. The history of mother country is our history in that sense. So the history of Britain, in terms of its constitutional and democratic development, is called the Mother of Parliaments, is one that the first, say, the Magna Carta is taken as a date. So let's take Magna Carta, 1215, King John. From that date, as a point of argument or marker, from 1215 to, say, the glorious revolution of the 17th century, 1648 and then 1688, is one of intense struggle between the king or the monarch, who claims to be sovereign, who claims to have divine right to rule. There's a vast body of literature about it. And the barons, that is, the people who hold the land, who have the money. And it is the jostling between the two in this almost half a millennium of history that we forget. And in this jostling, there's wars. There are dynastic wars, there's revolutionary wars, and the last war is the one in which the king is decapitated. Charles I is decapitated 100 years before the French decapitate their king, Louis XVIII or Louis XVI. So that decapitation, and then the reestablishment of monarchy, but under the control of the Parliament. The Parliament is supreme. And the people who run the Parliament are supreme. They make the law. There is no reference to the people. So when you talk about, common law and therefore freedom, yes, the Parliament protects the common law, protects the right for you to go and hunt, protect for you the right to bear arms, protect for you the right to fish, protect for you the right, to speak, to worship, so on and so. That protection comes from the Parliament. The Parliament can take it away, can abridge it. Unlike the American Constitution, we the people, the Bill of Rights in the American Constitution are those 10 amendments, and it cannot be taken away, it cannot be abridged, and the fight would be there. That was the Civil War. So there is a substantive difference in the words and in the history and in the mechanism. And so what we have, what Mr. Trudeau pulled together in 1980-82, in those 2 years, is a lesson of the inter-elite conflict. Because remember, and again, I put this on the table and I stop. Once the Dominion was given a constitution in 1867, there's a period of half a century where we acted simply in conformity with whatever the Mother of Parliament needed, or whatever was the Mother of Parliament requirement in terms of war and peace. We went to war when the Mother of Parliament declared war, the Boer War, the World War I, and so on. But a time came when the Mother of Parliament said that from now on, all the dominions are equal in status, equal in law, and the legislatures of the Dominion can make their own law. That was the Balfour Declaration in 1927, which was then formalized in the Statute of Westminster in 1931. that in effect the Canadian Parliament became sovereign, autonomous, bound to England by sentiments and history as the Commonwealth of Nations under the British Crown. Australia, New Zealand, Canada, India was not independent, South Africa, etc. However, from 1931 till 1980, that's 50 years, Robert, we refused to patriate BNA Act, or we could not patriate BNA Act. Why? Answer is very simple. Because of the intra-elite conflict and debate. They couldn't come up with a founding formula. And then certain events happened in 1980. Mr. Trudeau, who had been defeated in 79 election, came back to office, winning the 1980 election in January. And then there was a referendum in Quebec under Lévesque, and that referendum was lost by Parti Québécois, by René Lévesque, which opened up the whole new dynamics in which Trudeau knew this would be his last term in office, and he was going to impose a constitution. He would patriate a constitution, and he would put it together with an amending formula and a charter that he wanted, and he would put it in there, whether the premiers went along with him or not. And so the 2 years between 1980 and 1982 is the inter-elite conflict that goes on. And the people are sitting and watching that. Was there a constitutional conference? It was the first ministers' conferences that happened. Where was the people's referendum? Where was the people activity? And so you see the end product then, which is what my argument is, that what the unintentional but glorious effect for our constitutional history was the trucker convoy exposed the emperor has no clothes when it comes to the meaning of the people's right.
As a matter of fact, when you talk about the people, in our history, there have only been a couple of referenda where the people have been asked their opinion on matters. The joining of the province of Newfoundland in 1949, I think the referendum was 1948, but when it joined in 1949, you had Quebec have a couple of referenda asking whether or not the people still want to stay with the Confederation. And of course, there was the Meech Lake Accord. Wasn't there a referendum on that as well?
The Charlottetown Accord.
That's what I was referring to. Yes, Charlottetown Accord, sorry.
Yeah. Referendum, and that was defeated also by the people.
By the people.
In other words, the people did not. When the people were given the chance to vote, the people did not accept the agreement that was privately, so to speak, the elite, the 10 premiers and the prime minister, so the first ministers, by getting inside a room separately and negotiating, and then telling the people, here we have negotiated this deal, you now ratify it. And the people rejected it because the people hadn't participated in any form in those agreements. So yeah, we have that situation, and we have this constant tension. The status quo provinces of the Federation is Central Canada, primarily Ontario, right? But together, Central Canada means Quebec and Ontario, and though Quebec remains in a sense discontent with the 1982 Constitution Act that they did not sign on to, the elite has been very deferential to, very accommodating to Quebec's interests at the cost of the interests of other provinces. And so the ones that are most discontented is, of course, Alberta and the prairie provinces, Saskatchewan, Manitoba, and the interior. It was the Manitoba legislature that did not provide the unanimity to the Meech Lake Accord that led to its collapse. And then Clydewells of Newfoundland, who did not, vote for the accord. So in some ways, those divisions and cleavages remains unhealed. And the events of 2022, that is the trucker convoy and its aftermath, has only worsened those divisions in Canada, because it has come upon it came about as a result of the decision made by the parliament in terms of taking away what we believe, quote unquote, believe are our rights, by taking away those rights and stamping upon those rights, and so that has created even more grievances and even more cleavages. So that is the reality. But then why does and how does the elite, that is Ottawa, and all the political parties in Ottawa that is sitting in the parliament, with the exception of the PPC, which doesn't have a seat in the parliament. So all the parties, on what basis they go forward thinking that they can carry on as they have been doing without taking into account the wishes of the people? That would, of course, lead to a different conversation, because I would, again, just point out that in the last 50 years, going back to the 1970s, that is Pierre Trudeau's government that came into being, Canada has dramatically changed demographically, culturally, and what we have now is a Canada that has hollowed out the values, the foundational principles, take, say, common law that existed prior to the 1970s, and which the majority of Canadians took seriously as their defining character. What will happen in the last 50 years is two parallel things that has hollowed out Canada. And again, the elite doesn't want to talk about it, because it is the elites who have been engaged in bringing it about. One is open immigration. So people of different culture do not know the history of Canada, its foundation, its values, that bound for Canada together in terms of its difference with the United States and its bonds and connection with the mother country, and multiculturalism. So we have what began as multiculturalism with Pierre Trudeau ends up in multiculturalism, gender identity, wokeism with his son, who says Canada has no core identity. Canada is a post-national state. So, in other words, again, repeating myself, we have hollowed out our historical basis as a country.
It's the Freedom Convoy is labeled as such, Freedom Convoy, but I think it should also be called the Great Awakening, as we mentioned earlier, because of every part of our institutions have been now re-examined by the people, haven't they?
Exactly.
The press, the fourth estate, the press, and how they are bought and paid for. They're propagandist arm of the Liberal government. The Parliament, and as we've just been discussing here, our Constitution and the Senate, its role, the Supreme Court, its role, the provinces, their role, because most of the issues that the truckers had was with provincial mandates and provincial lockdown orders, because when it came down to it, the federal government had very little to do about all of those lockdowns. It had jurisdiction over flying and shipping and the borders, and of course distribution of the vaccine. But other than that, it was the provinces that imposed a lot of the things that many of the people on Parliament Hill went there to protest. And so this country, it's been a fascinating discussion, but this country is hurting. I would take away from what you discussed. This country is broken, I could say. It's still a country in name, at least. It's still ruled, by a parliament, and I use that word specifically. It is ruled. We, the people, don't have any say, more or less, in what goes on. every 4 years. We tell our rulers, we elect our rulers, is what happens. What kind of a country is that? I mean, it just doesn't make one want to be proud of this nation. It is what it is. There's nothing we can do about our history, that's for sure. That is set in stone. But where we go from here, I think we can take a lot of lessons from the Freedom Convoy's Great Awakening, where a lot of Canadians are now questioning their role, both in their own province. Should Alberta separate? Should Quebec separate? Should any of the other provinces? Can we deal with this kind of a centralized Laurentian elite telling us what to do? A disproportionate representation by Quebec in the Supreme Court, a disproportionate representation in the Senate. It is governed by regions, but still, it's not like in the United States where each state has 2 senators. Here we have a hodgepodge of 6 and 6 and others, for Ontario and Quebec. So it is quite an unequitable situation we have ourselves into. And I'll give you the last word, Salim. Do you see hope of change? Now that we've awoken up.
The last word would be an opening for another chapter of discussion. What we are, what sort of country we are. I think sadly, I think what we have, in a sense, proven to those of us who are discerning of our history is we are a vassal state. The elite prefers to be a vassal rather than to be a sovereign. We were a vassal state in our birth, as I read the letter of Sir Alexander Galt to the people in London, the imperial capital, asking for permission to become a dominion and asking also for a constitutional arrangement that would be written and approved by the imperial capital. So we began our journey in 1867 as a vassal. And then after World War I, but more particularly World War II, we became the vassal of the United States. And our leaders, made those decisions as the ground shifted in global politics with the end of the British Empire. And those leaders who were far more discerning of that fact of what had happened, Lester Pearson, Mackenzie King, there's the Liberal Party, the Laurentian elite, they realized and they understood that Britain was over, British Empire was over, and Britain had become the junior partner of Washington. It was Washington, it was the United States that now was the military economic power in the West. And the leadership moved. The leadership that was not that deeply connected with the realities of the world, and I'm referring here to John Diefenbaker, who came from Western Canada, from Saskatchewan, and was not plugged into the imperial capital during the war and after the war with what was happening. Staunchly believed, as I think many of the empire loyalists in Canada staunchly believe, that we are British, we are English, and that, our connection is strong and steady. But Britain wanted to, basically cast us aside. And that's exactly what happened. Britain was no longer going to defend Canada. And when Mr. Pearson went along with the demands of the New World after 1945, that is, readily accept the American leadership, Canada, under the Liberals, slipped onto that position of a vassal of the United States, And as the American politics has changed in the 1990s towards unipolar hegemony, which I think is now coming to its end, the desire or the wish of America to be the unipolar power, in effect, the empire, has been the role that the Democrats, the progressives chose for America, is to backstop, be the quarterback for the globalist agenda, the World Economic Forum, and so on. The ruling elite in Canada slipped into being the vassal of the globalist agenda under the leadership of America readily. And so the events that happened over the last 3-4 years, which triggered the Freedom Convoy movement in 2022, was brought about as a reaction to, whether conscious or unconscious, but as a reaction to the government's policies and decision, in which the government was following out the orders of their overlord as vassal, coming out of Davos and coming out of Washington.
It's true. We don't seem to be a nation that has come into itself yet, have we?
No, it hasn't. And that's the struggle. That is the struggle. I mean, in what way are we going to assert our sovereignty? If the sovereignty is going to be asserted on the basis of the existing arrangement, then the people are there simply as a token factor, not substantive. Look at our confederation. It is unequal in all aspects. It is unequal in the representation in Parliament, the House of Commons, by population. It is unequal in representation in the House of Federation, that is the Senate. So in which way can there be a check and balances? There is none.
While the structure of our state is broken, and I think that we both agree on that, our confederation is broken, and the structures, the institutions are broken and fundamentally flawed. I think that, and I want to leave this on a happy note, I think that the Freedom Convoy shows that the people are not necessarily broken. The people have an understanding of what they want, regardless of what our elites want. And with that, Salim, why don't we leave it there and then maybe revisit it next year and see just what may have changed in the intervening year. Thank you very much.
Thank you.